Chio woke before the bell at the temple down the valley had any reason to ring in the black cold of 4 in the morning, when the only sound in the inn was the settling of old wood and, far off, water moving over stone. She lay still a moment beneath the folded weight of the quilts, feeling the specific cold of a mountain village in January press against her face while the rest of her stayed warm, and she listened for the wind. There was none. That was good. A windless morning meant the snow outside would still be standing where it fell, soft and undisturbed, instead of driven into drifts against the kitchen door. She sat up in the dark and folded her sleeping robe closer at the throat before she reached for the clothes she had left within arm's reach the night before, because no one dressed slowly in a house this cold. Her fingers found the cotton, stiff with the chill, and she pulled it on quickly, working by feel more than sight, her breath showing faintly even inside the room. Somewhere on the other side of the paper screen, her mother was already awake. She could hear the particular creak of the floorboard by the kitchen step, worn soft and complaining under weight it had taken for 30 years. Chio smiled without meaning to. Her mother always won the race to be up first, and had never once let her forget it. She slid open the shoji to her room, the wooden groove catching for half a second the way it always did in winter, when the frame drew tight with cold, and stepped out into the corridor. The house was dark except for a single oil lamp, burning low near the kitchen, its flame no bigger than a fingertip, throwing just enough light to keep a person from putting a hand wrong on the doorframe. The corridor floorboards were icy through her socks, and she went up on the balls of her feet without thinking about it, the way she had done every winter morning since she was a girl too small to reach the charcoal shelf. In the kitchen, her mother, Fumi, crouched by the sunken hearth with a taper, coaxing the banked coals from the night before back into life. A thread of smoke rose and caught the lamp's small light, curling toward the blackened beams overhead. Beams that had gone the color of old iron from 40 winters of exactly this same smoke. The smell reached Chio before she was fully into the room, charcoal catching, and beneath it the cold mineral breath of the stone floor, and beneath that, very faint, the ever-present sulphur smell of the spring itself, which no one in the village noticed anymore except visitors, who always wrinkled their noses the first evening and never mentioned it again after the second. The fire wanted more coaxing than usual, Fumi said without turning around, blowing gently along the coals until a small orange thread caught and spread. "It's colder than yesterday." "It felt it," Chio said, crouching beside her, holding her hands not quite to the hearth, but near enough to feel the first offered warmth of the day. Her fingers had gone stiff on the walk from her room, 10 paces at most, and she worked them slowly, the small ache of returning feeling arriving in her knuckles first. No wind, though. No wind is a mercy. Her mother set a thin split of kindling across the coals, watched it take, and reached for a second. The firelight moved over her face, over the lines at the corners of her eyes that came from 40 years of exactly this kind of watching, patient and unhurried. A woman who had built 10,000 mornings the same way and trusted that this one would go no differently. "Your father's still at the bath. He went out before I did." Chio nodded. Her father went to check the bathhouse first on cold mornings, before anything else, to be certain no pipe had stiffened shut in the night and no chill had crept into water that guests would want deep and full and steaming by evening, It was one of perhaps 4 things he trusted to no one else, and had not trusted to no one else since before Chio could remember. The kettle went onto the hook above the hearth, and while it found its way toward warm, Chio carried the wooden rice bucket to the corner where the morning's portion was measured out each night before bed, so that no one had to think about it half asleep in the dark. She scooped the rice into the shallow washing basin, added water from the jar by the door, water her father had drawn the evening before so it wouldn't be frozen through by morning, and began to work it between her palms in slow circles, the grains hissing softly against the wood, the water clouding pale and starchy white. It was work her hands could do without her mind, the kind of task that let her thoughts wander loose while her body kept its rhythm, and this morning, as on most mornings, her mind wandered nowhere in particular. She simply washed the rice and listened to the fire settle into itself behind her, and felt the room begin, by degrees, too small to notice one at a time, to grow less cold. By the time she had drained the rice through the woven basket and set it to steam, her father's footsteps sounded in the corridor, unhurried and heavy in the particular way that meant his feet were half numb from the cold outside. Sadao came in, rubbing his hands together, a wool cloth wound around his neck against the draught, and went straight to the hearth to hold his palms toward the coals before he said anything at all. He was a broad, quiet man who had run the inn since his own father handed it to him, and Chio had rarely in her life seen him do a thing in a hurry, even things that seemed to call for hurrying. "The bath's fine," he said, mostly to the fire. "Held its heat through the night. I'll want more charcoal for it by midday, though. Genzo said he'd bring a load up before noon." "He always says before noon," Fumi said, setting the miso pot near the hearth's edge to warm slowly rather than boil. "And he always means somewhere near 2. He's not wrong to take his time. The road will be hard walking with a full sled." Sadao accepted the cup of hot water Chio poured him, wrapping both hands around it more for the warmth than for drinking, and looked toward the window, where the paper of the shoji had begun, almost imperceptibly, to lighten from black toward a deep blue-gray. "Snow held off again last night. 3rd morning running." "It'll come," Fumi said, without any particular worry in it, the way a person says a thing they've said every winter of their life. "It always comes eventually." Chio left them to their quiet talk and took up the 2 wooden buckets that hung by the kitchen door, going out to the well at the side of the house, where the bucket rope had gone stiff with frost overnight and had to be worked loose before it would run freely through the pulley. The cold outside was a different animal from the cold indoors. It had teeth in it, a clean sharpness that caught in her nose and made the small hairs inside it prickle with every breath. Snow lay a foot deep across the yard, unbroken except for her father's tracks from the bathhouse and back, blue shadowed in the last of the dark, and beyond the low wall she could see the shapes of the other houses of the village, none of them showing a light yet, except for a thin curl of smoke rising here and there where some other family's fire had also been coaxed awake. She lowered the bucket into the well and felt the rope go taut, then heavy, and hauled it up hand over hand, the wet wood biting cold against her palms even through the calluses she had built over years of doing exactly this. The water inside steamed faintly where it met the colder air, a small drama of temperature that she had watched every winter morning of her life and had never once tired of. She filled both buckets, set them on the yoke across her shoulders, and carried them back inside with the particular rolling gait that kept the water from slopping over the rims. A walk she'd learned so long ago, she couldn't remember learning it, only remembered failing at it as a girl and being laughed at kindly by her mother for arriving in the kitchen with wet feet. Inside, the kitchen had warmed enough that the cold no longer bit, only pressed pleasantly against the exposed skin of her hands and face, while her back, turned to the hearth, stayed warm. The rice steamer clicked and sighed on its pot. Her mother had begun slicing a daikon radish into thin rounds for the morning's pickle, her knife finding the same rhythm it had found every morning for decades, a soft, steady sound against the cutting board that Chio had fallen asleep to as a small child on nights when she'd been allowed to doze near the hearth while the adults finished their work. The smell of the miso, warming now rather than merely standing, began to fill the room, something rich and faintly sweet beneath its saltiness, mixing with the charcoal smoke and the cold outdoor air still clinging to Chio's sleeves. "Guests," her father said, setting down his empty cup. "We have 3 tonight. The Matsuda family is expected back. They always come this week, for the new year still lingering in them, I think, more than for the water. And a merchant traveling alone sent word up from the valley yesterday that he'd be through by evening." "Which room for the merchant?" Chio asked, already half turned toward the corridor where the guest rooms waited, dark and cold and unaired since the last visitors had left 4 days before. "The small one by the garden. He won't need more than that traveling alone, and it holds its heat better than the others." Chio nodded and went to begin the long work of the morning. The sweeping, the airing, the endless small preparations that turned an empty house back into one ready to receive people. While behind her, the rhythm of the kitchen carried on unbroken, her mother's knife, her father's low voice counting some figure to himself, the fire ticking softly as it ate through another length of wood. The guest rooms sat along the north side of the house, 4 of them in a row behind sliding paper doors, and Chio went down the line opening each one to let in whatever daylight had begun to gather outside, gray and thin as it was. The air inside had the particular staleness of a room that had stood shut and unheated for days, cold in a way that felt different from the cold of the kitchen, heavier, more settled, as though the room itself had been holding its breath. She knelt at the doorway of the first and began with the tatami, working the broom in long, even strokes along the grain of the woven rush matting, never against it, the way her mother had taught her before she was tall enough to reach the corners without kneeling. The straw gave off its own smell as the broom passed over it, dry and faintly sweet, grass cut and dried some summer now long past, and it mixed with the cold air coming through the open doors until the whole room smelled for a moment almost like the outdoors. She swept the dust toward the corridor rather than into it, a habit so old she no longer thought of it as a rule, and then knelt again with a folded cloth and a shallow basin of water carried from the kitchen and began on the wooden corridor boards outside the rooms, moving on hands and knees, the cloth pushed ahead of her in long, firm strokes that left a dark, wet stripe behind, drying almost as fast as she made it in air this cold and dry. Her knees knew this floor by now the way her hands knew the rice basin, every worn place, every board that had silvered pale from 40 years of exactly this wiping, the grain raised faintly beneath her palm, where the wood had given up its softer fibers to years of water and cloth and left only the harder grain standing. The corridor ran cold beneath her, the chill coming up through her knees, even through the folded pad she knelt on, and her breath showed pale in front of her face with each stroke. But the motion itself was warming, a small, honest labor that put color back in her hands. From the linen room at the end of the hall, she carried out the folded quilts, heavy woven cotton things stuffed thick against the winter, and draped them over the low railing of the veranda, where what daylight there was could reach them, and, more importantly, where the cold, dry mountain air could move through them and carry off whatever staleness had gathered while they sat folded in the dark. She beat each one lightly with a bamboo paddle, not hard, just enough to loosen the dust worked into the weave, and small clouds of it drifted off pale in the gray morning light before settling somewhere she'd never see them land. The paddle made a soft, flat sound against the cotton once, twice, 3 times to a quilt, and the cold nipped at her fingers between each one until she tucked them briefly under her arms to warm before taking up the paddle again. Down in the yard, Genzo's dog was barking at something. A bird, most likely, or nothing at all, the way dogs did on quiet mornings when there was little else to occupy them. And the sound carried clean and sharp across the snow, the way every sound carried in winter, once the wind had gone still. Somewhere further off, she could hear the low, steady rush of the stream that ran along the bottom of the village, never freezing all the way through, even in the hardest cold, because the spring fed it warm from underneath, a sound so constant in her life that she noticed it mostly by its absence on the rare still nights when for some reason it seemed to fall quiet. She worked her way back down the corridor, room by room, replacing each quilt once it had aired long enough, sliding the low charcoal braziers into position beside where a guest's bedding would eventually go, checking that each one was clean of yesterday's ash and ready to be filled fresh come evening. In the small room by the garden, the one her father had marked for the traveling merchant, she paused a moment longer than the others, straightening the single scroll that hung in the alcove, an ink painting of pine boughs bent under snow that had hung there so long she'd stopped truly seeing it, the way a person stops seeing their own hands. She looked at it now only because the room was otherwise so bare, and thought, without any particular weight to the thought, that whoever slept here tonight would be tired from the road and would likely not look at it either. By the time she had finished the 4th room, the light outside had gone from gray to a pale, flat white, the sky low and close the way it got before snow, though her father had said the snow would hold off yet again. She stood a moment on the veranda, with the last of the quilts still warming under her arm, looking out over the yard toward the low wooden roofs of the village scattered along the valley floor. Threads of smoke rising now from every chimney, thin white columns standing almost straight up in the windless air, before bending slowly east at the height of the rooftops. It was, she thought, going to be an ordinary day, and there was a particular comfort in knowing that before it had even properly begun. By the time she came back through to the kitchen, the rice had finished its steaming and stood in its wooden tub with a cloth laid over to keep the warmth in, and her mother had set out 3 bowls and 3 sets of chopsticks on the low table beside the hearth. The family's own meal always taken here rather than in any guest room, close to the fire, close to the work. They ate quickly and without much talk, the way people eat who have a long day already moving beneath them. Rice, the warmed miso with cubes of tofu her mother had cut that morning, a little of yesterday's pickled daikon, and a single grilled fish, that Sadao split evenly between the two women before serving himself the smallest portion, as he always did, a habit so old that no one in the family remarked on it any more. The fish had been salted and dried by a neighbor. Down toward the river crossing, someone Sadao traded charcoal accounts with in a loose, informal way that had gone on for so many years, neither of them could likely have named when it started, and it tasted, as it always did, faintly of wood smoke from its drying. Chio ate with her bowl held close beneath her chin, the old habit that kept warmth near her face in a room where the far corners never quite caught up to the hearth's heat, and watched the light through the kitchen's single small window climb slowly from white toward something with a little color in it, the flat gold of a winter sun that would clear the eastern ridge late and drop behind the western one early, giving the valley perhaps 6 honest hours of real daylight before the blue dusk crept back up from the stream bed. It was enough. It had always been enough. The work of the inn ran mostly by lamplight anyway in winter, and no one thought much of it. After the bowls were cleared and rinsed in the water Chio had drawn, she and her mother turned to the charcoal, the deep, endless, unglamorous work of moving fuel from the shed to every place in the house that needed it, a task that in winter never truly finished, only paused. Chio carried the wide, flat basket out to the woodshed at the back of the property, its roof sagging under a soft weight of snow that had built up gradually over the still nights and filled it from the standing supply, black lumps that left their mark on her palms no matter how careful she was. A faint, gray shine of dust worked into the lines of her skin that would not wash fully away until evening. She carried the basket balanced against her hip back through the yard, her breath clouding steady in front of her, and set to filling the small portable braziers that would warm the family's low table through the day and, later, be carried in fresh to each guest room once evening came. It was mid-morning when Genzo appeared at the gate with his sled, exactly as her father had predicted, some hours shy of noon rather than at it, the runners hissing softly over the packed snow of the lane, piled high with split charcoal wrapped in straw matting against the damp. He was an older man, thick through the shoulders from a lifetime of exactly this work, with a face gone the color of the wood he hauled, and he called a greeting to the house before he'd even reached the gate, his voice carrying easily in the still air the way every sound did that morning. "Sadao, your charcoal, before the road turns to mud on me and I'm stuck hauling it through slush instead." Her father came out to meet him, and the two men fell into the unhurried business of unloading, hauling bundle after bundle from the sled to the shed, their breath rising together in twin clouds while they talked. The depth of the last snowfall, whose roof needed clearing before the next one came, whether the temple bell had sounded a little flat lately, or whether it was only the cold doing something to the ear that heard it. Chio caught pieces of it as she passed back and forth with her own basket, and smiled once at something she only half heard, a comment about a chicken of Genzo's that had apparently taken a dislike to the snow and refused to leave the coop, a small complaint delivered with such affection that it was clearly not a complaint at all. By the time the sled stood empty, and Genzo had accepted a cup of hot water at the kitchen door before starting back down the lane, the sun had climbed as high as it meant to climb that day, a pale disk sitting low over the southern ridge, throwing long blue shadows across the snow that would barely shorten before they began, in only another hour or two, to lengthen again toward evening. Chio stood a moment in the yard with the empty basket at her feet, working the ache from her lower back with both hands, and looked down the lane after Genzo's retreating sled, the runner tracks already filling faintly at the edges where the cold worked to smooth them over. Somewhere down in the valley on the road that climbed up from the river crossing, a stranger she had never met was walking toward the inn with a case of seed samples on his back, though she didn't know that yet, and wouldn't for several hours more. The bathhouse stood a little apart from the main building, connected by a covered wooden walkway that let a person cross between them without stepping out into open weather, and it was here that Chio spent the better part of the early afternoon, working alongside her father to ready the water for evening. The room held its own particular warmth, even with the doors propped for airing, a damp heat that clung to the wooden walls and beams, and the smell here was different from the kitchen smell, mineral and faintly sulphurous, the breath of the spring itself rising off the deep stone-lined tub where the water sat still and clear, filling slowly from the pipe that carried it down from the source higher on the mountainside. Steam curled off the surface in slow ropes that caught the light from the small high window and turned, briefly, the pale color of the sky. She knelt at the tub's wooden rim with a stiff brush and a bucket of clean water and worked along the stone, scrubbing at the faint mineral deposits the spring left behind, no matter how carefully the water was tended, a pale crust that built along the waterline like a tide line on some shore none of them had ever seen. It was not hard work so much as patient work, the kind that asked for steady attention rather than strength, and her knees found the same worn groove in the wooden decking that they found every day, a slight hollow polished smooth by years of exactly this kneeling. The brush made a soft rasping sound against the stone, rhythmic, almost pleasant, and beneath it she could hear the water itself, a constant faint murmur where it entered from the pipe and stirred the surface into slow circles. "Careful along that seam," her father said, from where he crouched, checking the wooden slats of the floor for any give in the joints, a thing he did every few days out of a caution that had never once, in Chio's memory, turned up an actual problem, but which he performed anyway with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who liked his caution better spent than needed. "The stone there always gathers more than its share." "I remember," Chio said, and did remember because she had been shown this exact seam by this exact man perhaps 1,000 times across as many days, and found that she did not mind the repetition, not really. There was something steadying in a piece of knowledge handed down so many times it had worn as smooth as the decking beneath her knees. They worked without much more talk after that, the companionable kind of quiet that came easily between people who had done the same work beside each other for years, and the room slowly filled with the good, clean smell of scrubbed stone and mineral water, and the faint wood smoke drift that found its way in from the firebox where the water was heated, a firebox her father fed steadily with split logs, so that by the time evening came and guests wanted their turn, the water would stand at exactly the depth and warmth it was meant to. Outside, through the small high window, Chio could see the sky had thickened somewhat since morning, gone from flat white to a deeper gray that pressed low over the ridge, and she thought her father might finally be wrong about the snow holding off, though she said nothing of it, since he so rarely was. When the tub stood full and the stone scrubbed clean along every seam her father cared about, they left the bathhouse doors cracked to let the last of the airing finish and crossed back along the covered walkway to the main house, where the smell of the kitchen reached them before they'd even slid the door open. The sharp, bright smell of vegetables being prepared for the evening meal, a mountain yam being peeled, its slightly slippery scent mixing with the ever-present charcoal, and, beneath everything, that same faint mineral breath of the spring that never quite left any room in the house, so constant a presence that a person only noticed it, as Chio's mother liked to say, on the day they finally left the village and found its absence strange. Fumi looked up from the low table where she was slicing the yam into thin, translucent rounds, her knife never pausing in its rhythm. The Matsuda family sent word by the temple boy. They'll arrive by mid-afternoon ahead of the merchant. Chio, will you see the second room readied properly, the one they always ask for? And mind the older daughter likes an extra cushion if we have one to spare. I remember which one she likes, Chio said, already moving toward the linen cupboard, and felt, as she often did in these small, ordinary exchanges, a quiet satisfaction in being the kind of person who remembered such things, not because anyone had asked her to be, but because it was simply the shape her days had worn into over the years, attentive in the small ways that made a guest stay comfortable without the guest ever quite noticing why. The Matsuda family arrived a little after the sun had begun its slow slide behind the western ridge, their voices reaching the inn before their footsteps did, a cheerful commotion of 2 parents and 3 children who had clearly spent the last stretch of the mountain road arguing pleasantly about who had seen the most snow monkeys along the way. Chio heard them from the entryway and had the low wooden step already swept clear, and the guest slippers set out in a neat row by the time the sliding door rattled open and the cold rushed in ahead of them, carrying with it the sharp, clean smell of outdoor air and, faintly, the wet wool of traveling coats. We made good time, the father called out, stamping snow from his boots on the stone step before easing them off. Better than last year, though my youngest insists we stop to look at every single icicle on the mountain. There were a great many icicles, the youngest said gravely, a boy of perhaps 7, already working at the laces of his own small boots with the fierce concentration children brought to tasks adults found simple. Chio knelt at the entryway to help him, since his fingers had gone clumsy with cold, and set his boots neatly beside the others in the row of wooden shelving built for exactly this purpose, no shoes ever crossing the raised threshold into the house itself, a rule so old and so universal that none of the children even glanced twice at it, though the youngest eyed the row of guest geta waiting by the inner step with open interest, clearly already planning an evening of clattering across the garden path in them. You'll want to look at the garden bridge later, Chio told him, straightening. There's a icicle there taller than your father, if it hasn't dropped yet. He brightened considerably at this news, and his older sister, the one who liked the extra cushion, gave Chio a small private smile over his head, the smile of an older sibling well used to her brother's enthusiasms and mildly fond of them anyway. Chio led the family down the corridor she had swept and wiped that morning, sliding open the door to the room they always requested, where the brazier already sat filled and glowing faintly, taking the first true edge off the room's chill, and where a fresh cotton robe lay folded for each of them, striped in the inn's own simple pattern, meant to be worn loose and comfortable for the whole of their stay once they'd changed out of their traveling clothes. The mother sank onto the tatami with an unhurried sigh that seemed to shed the entire day's journey in one breath and looked around the small room with the particular contentment of someone arriving somewhere familiar rather than somewhere new. "It's exactly as it was," she said, mostly to herself, running a hand over the low table's worn surface. "I always forget how much I've missed it until I'm sitting here again." "We're glad to have you back," Chio said, and meant it plainly, without any performance in the meaning. The Matsudas came every year at this season, and something in their return, predictable as the turning of the month, had become one of the small fixed points Chio measured her own year against, the way her father measured his by the depth of the first snow, or the day Genzo's plum tree budded. "I'll bring tea shortly, and the bath will be ready whenever you'd like it, before or after." "After, I think, once we've thawed out a little first," the father said, already easing himself down beside his wife with the particular groan of a man whose knees had opinions about mountain roads. Chio slid the door shut behind her, leaving them to their unpacking and their settling in, and went to fetch the tea, moving back down the corridor, past the small room by the garden, still empty, still waiting, the scroll of snow-bent pine hanging undisturbed in its alcove. Outside, through the corridor's end window, she could see the light had thinned further, the flat gray of the sky pressing down closer to the ridgeline now, and somewhere below, on the road that wound up from the river crossing, a second traveler, one she had not met, one whose face she could not yet picture, was making his own slow way up through the cold toward the same warm lamplight the Matsuda family had just walked into. He arrived as the last gray light was giving way to true dusk, a thin man of perhaps 40, with a wide, flat case strapped across his back and a walking stick worn pale at the grip from long use, stamping up to the entryway with the particular stiffness of someone who had covered more ground than his legs had truly wanted to give. He introduced himself as Onodera, a seed merchant working the mountain villages before the roads closed properly for the winter, and he said it with the small practiced courtesy of a man who explained himself at a great many doorways in the course of a season. "I hope you've room," he added, easing the case from his shoulders with visible relief, "though I confess I'd have walked another 2 hours in the dark rather than turn back down to the valley tonight." "We've room," Chio said, taking the case from him before he could protest, surprised, as always, at how heavy such a flat thing could be, packed as it was with paper packets of seed, sorted by kind and season. "The small room by the garden, it holds its warmth well." He thanked her with the slightly formal gratitude of a man traveling alone, unused to being fussed over, and eased off his boots at the step, setting them beside the Matsuda children's smaller pairs with a faint smile at the sight, the kind of smile that suggested he was thinking of children of his own somewhere down in the valley, though he said nothing of it, and Chio didn't ask. She led him to his room, laid his case carefully in the corner where it wouldn't be underfoot, and left him with a robe and the offer of tea, which he accepted gladly, rubbing warmth back into his hands the same way every guest did on first arriving, the same way Chio herself had done that very morning at the hearth. Back in the kitchen, the evening's real work had begun in earnest, and the room had transformed itself in the short time Chio had been occupied with guests, her mother moving between the hearth and the low preparation table with the brisk efficiency of a person managing 3 trays worth of cooking at once, timed so that everything might reach its room hot and ready within moments of the last. Fish lay cleaned and scored on a wooden board, ready for the grill set over the coals. A pot of rice, freshly cooked, stood covered near the fire, and the mountain yam fumi had been slicing that afternoon, now sat simmered soft in a shallow pan with soy and a little sugar. It smelled rich and faintly caramel, beneath the sharper scent of the fish beginning to char at its edges. 3 trays tonight instead of 5, Fumi said, not looking up from the grill, where she turned the fish with a practiced flick of her wrist just as its skin began to blister and crisp. The Matsudas will eat together in their room, as they always do, so that's 1 large tray rather than 5 small ones. Simpler in its way, though there's more of everything on it. And Mr. Onodera on his own, Chiyo said, already reaching for the stack of lacquered trays kept for exactly this purpose, their black surfaces worn to a soft shine by years of careful handling, each one holding its own small compartments and bowls, arranged in the same order her mother had taught her before she was tall enough to see over the preparation table without a step stool. Modest for him. A traveling man doesn't want to be made to feel he's imposed on a house by arriving without notice. Fumi lifted the fish from the grill onto a small plate with quick, precise movements, the skin gone a deep gold brown, blistered and fragrant, and set it aside to rest a moment before it went on to its tray. Though modest doesn't mean thin. Give him a full bowl of rice at least. A man walking mountain roads all day has earned it. Chiyo began assembling the trays in the order she'd learned so long ago. It required no thought at all. Rice first, set slightly to the left. The small bowl of soup beside it, the grilled fish laid along the tray's far edge, the simmered yam and a dish of pickled vegetables filling the remaining space with the careful, unhurried arrangement that made even a simple meal look, by the time it reached a guest's low table, like something considered and cared for rather than merely served. Before the trays went out, the guests took their turns at the bath, and Chiyo heard them pass along the covered walkway in 2s and 3s throughout the early evening, their voices dropping to the particular hush people fell into on the way to hot water and cold air, footsteps quick and light in borrowed wooden gita that clacked softly against the walkway boards. She caught a glimpse of the youngest Matsuda boy dashing ahead of his sister, robe flapping loose at the knee, delighted by the cold biting at his face while the rest of him stayed warm beneath the cotton, and heard his mother call after him to slow down before he slipped, though there was no real worry in her voice, only the reflexive caution of a parent who had called the same words 100 times before and expected, this time, as every time, to be gently ignored. From the kitchen, if she paused long enough at her work, Chiyo could hear the faint sounds of the bath being enjoyed. A splash, a low, contented sigh carried strangely clear across the cold, intervening air. Once even a small burst of laughter from the boy that made her mother look up from the hearth and smile without a word. The bath-house in winter held a particular kind of pleasure that Chiyo understood completely, having grown up with it. The shock of cold air against wet skin stepping out, balanced against the deep, unhurried heat of the water itself. Heat that reached all the way into a person's spine and stayed there long after they'd dried off and dressed again. A warmth that outlasted the bath by hours. By the time the family had returned to their room, hair still damp, faces flushed pink from the hot water, and the cold walk back, their tray was ready, and Chiyo carried it in herself, balanced with the ease of long practice, and knelt to set it before them on the low table, arranging each dish precisely as she'd been taught, though the arrangement would be disturbed within moments by 5 hungry travelers. The room had warmed further with the brazier and with their own bodies, and the smell of the grilled fish reached them before Chio had even finished setting the last bowl in place, drawing an appreciative sound from the father that needed no words to translate. "Please enjoy," she said, and rose to leave them to their meal, sliding the door most of the way shut behind her, leaving only a narrow gap for warmth to be checked on later, without disturbing them further. Mr. Onodera's tray she carried down to the small room by the garden a little after, finding him sitting quietly in his robe, with the scroll of snow-bent pine drawing his gaze in the lamplight, an expression on his face that suggested he was, in fact, looking at it properly, unlike most guests who pass through the room without truly seeing it. "A fine piece," he said, as she set the tray before him, nodding toward the alcove. "Old work, I'd guess, from the ink?" "My grandfather's, I believe, though I've never asked exactly how old," Chio admitted. "It's hung there longer than I've been alive to notice it." He smiled at that, a tired, genuine sort of smile, and thanked her for the tray, remarking on the fish's smell before he'd even lifted his chopsticks, and Chio left him to his solitary meal with the particular satisfaction that came from watching a tired traveler finally properly settle. Back in the kitchen, she and her mother ate their own meal, standing at moments and sitting at others, snatching the family dinner in the gaps between carrying trays and checking braziers, a meal eaten in fragments the way it always was on evenings with guests in the house, though neither of them minded it, having never known the work to go any other way. Later, once the trays had been cleared and washed and stacked back in their place, their lacquer surfaces wiped dry and gleaming faintly in the lamplight, Chio went down the corridor once more to lay out the bedding, sliding open each door softly in case a guest had already drifted toward sleep after the day's travel and the bath's deep warmth. In the Matsuda's room, the children were still awake but drowsy, sprawled loose-limbed on the tatami in a way that spoke of full stomachs and warm skin, and the parents thanked her quietly as she drew out the futons from the wall cupboard where they were stored by day, unfolding them across the floor in the space the low table had occupied only an hour before. Table and cushions moved aside now to make room for sleep. The futon smelled faintly of the cold outdoor air they'd been aired in that very morning, a clean, dry scent that would fade by midnight into something warmer, closer, human. "Sleep well," she said, tucking the edge of the topmost quilt straight. "And if the brazier burns low in the night, there's more charcoal just outside the door, in the basket." The mother thanked her again, already gathering her youngest toward the bedding with the practiced motion of long habit, and Chio slid the door most of the way closed, leaving the room to its own settling quiet. In the small room by the garden, Mr. Onodera had finished his tray and sat now with a cup of tea, looking out through a gap in the shoji at whatever could be seen of the dark garden beyond, a faint shape of trees against a sky gone fully black. He seemed, Chio thought, a man comfortable enough in his own solitary company, the kind who had made peace with long roads and unfamiliar rooms through sheer repetition. And he thanked her simply when she laid out his futon, remarking only that the room was every bit as warm as she'd promised. "The mountain roads will be kinder in spring," she offered, folding back the top quilt in invitation, "if you pass through again." "I always do this time of year," he said, and something in the way he said it suggested a genuine fondness for the rhythm of his own returning, not unlike the Matsuda's, though his was a solitary version of the same comfort. There's a kind of ease in a place that stays the same while everything else changes size and price and temper. I've watched 3 towns lower in the valley change past, knowing in the years I've walked this route. Not here. Chio said nothing to that beyond a small nod, not because she had nothing to say, but because the observation seemed to want no answer, only to be received, the way a person receives weather. She left him to his tea and his window, and made her way back toward the kitchen, checking each brazier along the corridor as she passed, feeding a little more charcoal into the ones burning low, banking the coals in a way that would let them hold their heat through the deepest hours of the night without needing tending again until dawn. The house had settled by now into its evening quiet, the particular hush that fell once guests were fed and bedded and the day's louder business had passed, leaving only the small sounds underneath it, the creak of old wood cooling, the faint hiss of a brazier settling its coals, and somewhere beneath everything, always, the low constant murmur of the stream at the bottom of the village, indifferent to the hour, running on exactly as it had before anyone in the house was born, and would long after everyone in it had gone quiet for good. In the kitchen, Fumi had banked the hearth for the night, leaving a small bed of coals glowing dull red beneath a covering of ash, enough to be coaxed back easily come morning without having to start again from nothing. Sadao sat at the low table with the account book open before him, a stub of pencil in hand, working through the day's small figures by the light of a single oil lamp. The cost of Genzo's charcoal weighed against what the 3 rooms would bring in, a column of numbers he moved through slowly and without any particular urgency, the way he did everything. Chio watched him a moment from the doorway, his broad shoulders bent over the book, his lips moving faintly as he checked a sum, and thought that she had watched him do exactly this on exactly this many evenings, that the sight itself had become a kind of comfort, proof that the day had closed the way every other day closed, in quiet arithmetic by lamplight. 3 good rooms tonight, he said without looking up, sensing her there the way a person senses another's presence after decades of sharing close quarters. The merchant's a fair payer, doesn't haggle like some do, coming through in winter, thinking we ought to be grateful for anyone at all willing to climb the road. He seemed glad enough to be here, Chio said, coming to sit near the table's edge, close enough to the last of the hearth's warmth to feel it against her shins. Said he likes that the village doesn't change. Villages change, her father said, closing the book at last and setting the pencil down beside it, only slower than towns do. Give it enough years, and even a mountain will change its shape, though no one alive to see it start will live to see it finish. He said this without any weight of sadness in it, only the plain observation of a man who had spent his whole life watching small things shift by degrees too slow to notice day to day, and who had made his peace with that pace long before Chio was old enough to wonder about it herself. Fumi came to sit beside them with the last of the tea, and for a little while the 3 of them stayed there in the kitchen's dying warmth, not talking much, simply sharing the particular ease of a family that had finished its work for the day and had nowhere left to be, but exactly where it already was. Chio let her eyes half close, listening to the small sounds of the house around her, the coals ticking faintly under their blanket of ash, her father's breathing slow and even beside her, a soft snore already beginning to rise from somewhere down the corridor where one of the Matsuda children had apparently succumbed to sleep well ahead of the rest of the family. When at last her mother rose to bank the last of the lamps, Chio took her own turn at the wash basin near the kitchen door, the water gone cool now, but not unpleasantly so, and scrubbed the day's gray charcoal dust from beneath her fingernails and the pale mineral traces of the bathhouse stone from her palms, the small private ritual that closed every one of her evenings the same way it had closed this one. She dried her hands on the rough cotton towel that hung by the door, feeling in her own tiredness the particular satisfaction of a body that had been steadily useful since before dawn, not worn thin by the day, but rounded out by it, filled rather than emptied. In her room, she slid the shoji shut behind her against the corridor's draft and knelt to draw her own futon from its cupboard, laying it out in the dark mostly by feel, her hands finding the familiar folds without needing a lamp to guide them. The small brazier she kept for her own room had been filled that afternoon along with all the others, and it glowed now low and steady in the corner, throwing just enough warmth to take the true edge from the night air without heating the room past the point of comfort a good thick quilt could finish on its own. She undressed quickly in the cold, folding her clothes for the morning and setting them within arm's reach exactly as she had found them absent that same dawn, and slid beneath the quilts, drawing them up close around her shoulders, feeling the day's last warmth already gathering in the small space her body made. Outside, somewhere past the paper of the shoji, she could hear the faint clack of Geta on the covered walkway, her father likely, making his final round to check the bathhouse door was properly latched against the night, and beneath that, steady as it had been since before she was born, the low, unhurried voice of the stream at the bottom of the village, running on through the dark exactly as it always did, needing no one's attention to keep on running. She thought, drowsily, of the icicle by the garden bridge, and whether it had grown any longer since morning, and whether the youngest Matsuda boy would still be talking about it at breakfast. The thought softened at its edges before she had properly finished having it, the way thoughts did at the close of a long ordinary day, and somewhere in the middle of wondering whether snow would finally come before dawn, Chio let go of the question entirely and slept.